First, I'm going to tell you how you're going to do this thing this morning. Since we are a duo doing it, so the duet will be as follows. First, we're going to put Petria in the corner, and nobody puts Petria in the corner usually. And then I'm going to introduce the talk to you. And since there are a lot of students that I've noticed in the audience, one tends to think that creativity or inspiration will dawn on you, which is obviously not true. So what we're going to do, Peter, we're going to introduce a model to them. And although Peter said that no model works, they're all wrong, hopefully this one will be useful. And I hope it will help you to understand how your own design process works. And then Petria will start introducing our own work and explaining this model and the work, and then I'll do another 3 buildings, and then we'll conclude, and hopefully we'll make it in 45 minutes. So here we go. The title promises to demystify the design process. It's obviously nonsense. We cannot demystify it. It's not possible. It's an age-old question. How does design work? This presentation merely is an attempt to explain to you our own design process in a small practice that we've been doing for 10 or 15 years. We are married and we're in an architectural practice. How does that work? We will start with the design of our own house, and then we'll continue onwards with mainly residential work that we're doing in the practice. When post-rationalizing what you see on the screen at the moment, we realized that the work was first of all done intuitively in the beginning, and then later on became more organized into dedicated roles for each other, and with a conscious design process. We both taught at the University of the Free State Architecture Department for 24 years, each, that is, and hence the interest in the design methodology. And I started asking myself, how can I teach design to students if I do not understand how they think? What's going on in their minds, and mind you, in my own? Am I going to teach them the way I'm doing it? Is that the way to teach? Or can I understand the way their mind works and try and adapt to that and help them along? Which is a tricky question altogether. We used what we taught at the university in our own practice. The practice actually became a laboratory for what we taught at the varsity. And it started off with small buildings, and it's still, by choice, only residential work, mainly. Small and easy to handle for only the 2 of us, and from time to time, other people that we bring in. People will always ask us, how can you work together as a married couple? Don't you fight? Of course we do. She always wins, but nonetheless, I just agree. She thinks she's winning. We are flip sides of the coin. We are 2 parts working together as one. We've got the same goal in mind, but we've got 2 directions to reach that goal. And I think that is the key of the talk, and you'll soon understand what I'm saying. So there's actually very little fighting in the practice, since we know where we're going and what each other's roles are. To start off, we usually hand out briefs to students when we were still teaching. You'll hand out to a class 40 brief, the same problem, and you get 40 designs back, all different. There might be similarities, but they're completely different. How is that possible? One question, 40 different answers. The reason is simple, we're all different. Okay. What did Le Corbusier, one of the big architects of the modern movement, said? We are all the same. We've got the same needs. What does this imply? If we've got the same needs, why is all architecture not the same? Why is it not a recipe? Because that is what it implies. There are many opinions on the subject, many books written, interesting books if you're looking for reading matter on it. Those three are the most interesting ones probably to read. But let's look at two of the gurus then of the modern movement. The first, Frank Lloyd Wright in America. On his design process, he said, he starts with the earth, with the ground, and that will tell him what to do. It will give him all the clues, whether it's flat, hilly, whatever. And in his work, it's quite clear that this was his way of working, an organic way of adapting to site, with his most famous building, Falling Waters. An opposite opinion, as famous, Le Corbusier. What did he say? You can read through it, but what he said is, he follows organization patterns of people, and that the plan will tell him what to do. An analysis. It's quite different in approach. And the architecture is quite different as well. As good, but definitely different. So, how do you pinpoint what's happening here? We all know that creativity's got to do with the left and the right side of the brain, nothing new to that. The left side is to do with the order, language, if I remember correctly, while the right side is probably the more creative side. Does this help us? What does it help you to know that your right brain is doing the things you're supposed to do? It's no model to help you. We were searching to understand what is the mental makeup of a designer. What's happening in the brain or in a process? And we found this guy, David Kolb, who's in Chicago, and with a very interesting model, experiential learning. So it's all about learning. And to understand that, he's working with a cycle, a clockwise cycle, starting at the top with concrete experience. So what he's saying is, if you want to learn something, understand something, if your brain needs to understand it, you first need to experience something concrete, real. Then to the right, you will reflect on the experience. Then you'll understand it better. You need time to reflect. After that, you'll form a concept, an abstract concept of what you've reflected upon. And then it will go into doing something with it, an experiment. So starting from experience, thinking about it, reflecting on it, making it a concept, you can start working with it, doing it. And then it will go to a next cycle of experience again. So it's like a spiral rather than a cycle. Right, so that was the idea of how to learn. How does the brain work? How does it filter information? When we look at that, the same model, at the top you've got the concrete experience, which has got to do with feeling, emotions. At the bottom, polar opposite, is thinking, rational, logic. So those two opposites are polar opposites on that line. So I'm going to invite you to play along. Position yourself and see how you think, how your brain functions and perceive information. If feeling, emotion is at the top, zero in the middle, and facts, thinking at the bottom, where will you place yourself? No, not in the middle. Most people will tell you, oh, I'm very balanced. I think in the middle. For the past 10 years that I've been doing this with students, not one was in the middle. So, not possible. You need to choose whether you take your decisions emotional or by gut feeling, or do you think about it logical? Okay, for example, let's say you tend to move towards the more emotional. That will be a 3, whatever. All right, example. So you've got yourself on that line. Perfect. Now we move on. According to Kolb, then, the left and the right-hand side, they are polar opposites as well. Left is, what do you do with this information? Do you do something, or do you think about it, reflect on it? So, on a horizontal line, where will you put yourself? 0 in the middle. Are you a doer, experimenting with information, or are you waiting, watching, looking, understanding it? Okay, for example, let's say you're leaning towards the doing side. Right, put the two on top of each other, the 2 lines. Now we've got the 2 dots, connect them, and that will give you a tendency, what we will tend to be doing or not doing. Right. So, just for interest's sake, just to test whether you listen to what I'm saying, let's see how many people are in that top left corner. Just an indication. Okay. Top right. Not that many. Bottom right. Okay. Bottom left. Good. A nice spread. Equal parts. Right. What does it mean? So what? So what? Right. Here we go. And we're going now with a cycle, clockwise. Concrete experience will combine with reflective observation. That will be called diverger. And it's nothing to do with a movie, although there are similarities. It means you can do a lot of things. So it's like the movie. You can do a lot of things. It means you're reacting on feeling, gut feeling, or experience, and you're looking at it from different perspectives. Right. If you put yourself in that corner, see if that's true. The next one is a assimilator, meaning you're gathering information. You're based on facts, the bottom, but looking at it from different directions. That's more scientific. Then the converger, meaning focused. You've got facts and you do something with it, the engineers. Then the top left is the accommodators, reacting on gut feeling but doing something immediately. Right, that's accommodating. And that will tell you briefly what this model does. For interest's sake, occupations, jobs, where are they? Humanities, top right. Sciences, bottom right. Facts, research. Converger, bottom left. Engineers, facts, do something. Mathematics, the bridge needs to stand up, but it needs to be done. And then top left, the social professions. Medicine, law, whatever. Quick decision making, do something with it. More detail even. Pinpoint yourself or your own profession. As far as I've noticed, we've got people from the arts, music, journalism, foodies, architects in the audience. That's roughly where it's supposed to be, according to David Kolb. But please notice, it's a cycle. If you're an architect or architecture student, you need to move through the cycle and not pinpoint yourself in one corner. Right. I'm going to explain quickly the divergent and the qualities of that, and you'll see just now in the work why this is important. The diverger is always asking or looking for meaning in life, asking the question, why? Why did it happen? They're sometimes more interested in the people that didn't commit the murder than the one that did commit the murder, because the question is more interesting than the answer. So, the diverger will generate alternative ideas, very creative, imaginative, open-ended questions, answers, process rather than product orientated, easily recognize problems, functions well in groups, brainstorming. People. Right. Obviously, the upside always have an opposite negative side. The weaknesses is writing down problems, living in words rather than doing. Write down problems. Design remains an idea or a concept because they're not doers. They're paralyzed or lost with all the possibilities, unable to decide for themselves, and poor at managing time. Right. The diverger, bottom right, is the conceptual people. They ask what? Many ideas, many concepts, but they search for one answer. Why? Because it's factual. There's a correct and a wrong, and you need to get that correct answer. Obviously difficult for design, because there's never only one answer. Analytical thinking. They like to order things. They like to work with checklists. They will keep you on time, usually. They're good at organizing. And Petria is telling me to move up and move on. And they're theoretically strong. All right, the weaknesses, they're searching for one answer as well. Linear design process. If something's wrong, they'll restart from the beginning. Diagrammatic or scientific in their approach. They're formulistic. They're looking for a formula that will work for them. Design in isolation. They're not people. They like things, not people. High stress levels, and they work on a checklist. Usually very selfish as well, between the lines. Friend Aura Hubert won't mind if I put her in this category, because we work together on this, working according to a very strict modular system, scientific, math-like organization. Right. The converger. Use theories and ideas in a practical way, good at problem solving, strong belief in the correct and the wrong, black and white people, quick decision makers, perfectionists. Their weaknesses, they're very stubborn. They will tell you what's wrong and what's right, because they know, after all. Not open to many ideas. They might solve the wrong problem, but they will solve a problem. They will fall in unnecessary details. They're probably conventional thinking because they decide what's right and what's wrong, and they're formalistic designers, not formula, but formalistic, meaning form-driven, because it's structural engineering, and tend to work in isolation as well, because nobody can learn them that much after all. Typical work, form-driven, structural-driven, is typical examples that we see in our cities today, that taught to our students' work. All right, and the accommodator is adapting to situations and asking the question, what if? What if that happens? What will happen then? They're conceptual designers, gut feeling, strong on form but more sculptural. So it's not structural but sculptural. They work with models, three-dimensional immediately, several design possibilities, work in groups like brainstorming, get the job done, quick decision makers. The downside, favor feelings over theory or logic. They will go with their gut feeling. Trivial improvements to the design. Get bored very quickly, lose interest. Use concept as substitute for final design because they're slightly lazy. They want to get to the end. Use concept, I have to say that, hit and run designers rather than analytical. That's too much work. not perfectionist, and can leave a design unrefined. Good. An example, I think Marguerite Leroux Pinar is in the audience, a student work of her on Tolkien as a student, creative, conceptual, typical competition work. Right. I'm going to explain it more in detail, moving towards the work now, in detail about the work that we've done in the studio with students. I've worked with the fourth-year students, and I gave them the same LSI. LSI is a learning style inventory, just to try and see how they think. The same I did with you, but more detail, obviously. Without them knowing the outcome, I divided them into the 4 groups, gave them an A3 white page, and set a design problem. The problem was simple. Design a furniture shop in Knysna, just off the main road, in an historic area. Decide what you're going to do, go into the 4 corners of the room. I'll give you 15 minutes, come back. That was all. They did that, and this was the result. Top right, the divergers, came back with that. Ideas, orientation, not related necessarily, but a lot of ideas written down. Note. The assimilators, bottom right, came back with a list with programming it, a checklist. This first, second, third, then you do this, then you do that. Written down again. The convergers, the engineers, came back with that. Drawings of the structure. How are you going to solve this shed? Because they decided it's going to be a shed. All right, with one note on the drawing. Structure to allow for known restrictions. The top left, the accommodators, came back with only drawings and a few notes. The notes saying, breaking of box, creating a facade, conceptual ideas. When you put all of these together in Kolb's model, that's what it looked like. Clearly on the left-hand side is the doers. Clearly on the right-hand side is the thinkers. Just for interest's sake, the bottom part is the introverts and the top, the extrovert people, working on gut expression. The bottom, working on facts, keep to themselves. So that's a typical demonstration of what will happen in a studio and what's happening in this audience at the moment. And what's happening in our practice as well. Right, to understand our practice, small practice, 2-man band, and not much flexibility within that. Fortunately, we're polar opposites already, as a given. I'm reacting on gut feeling, accommodator. Petria is a converger. And that's what I said. She will tell you what's right and what's wrong. So we're polar opposites already. And that's what I said. We approach the design problem from 2 angles, but with the same goal in mind. The 2 parts that's absent, I need to play the diverger role as well. Look at different possibilities, because I'm close to it. I can understand that. Petria needs to play the assimilating role, the analysis part, because it's factual and close to her. So that is how we will approach design problems. To understand our work, you need to understand that we're working with a natural landscape, or within the natural landscape. Almost all the work has been done in the natural landscape. Completely coincidence, I don't know why it happened. I don't know why people in the city don't ask us to design buildings, but apparently we cannot. So we work in the landscape. And we try to create imaginative places, and we work with the earth, with the atmosphere. My world, I think it skipped one, my understanding of place is like this. Photography, capturing places, playing with the photos, and I'm really not that good, but I just enjoy doing it, because it's a gut feeling. And then I will paint watercolor. to understand or capture moments, either realistic or then abstract. And this became a process in the practice as well. Understanding the place and then a process of abstracting that. That's my world. Now Petria can introduce her world to you.
Sorry, my world is not as pretty as Jan's, but it's pretty precise. I will explain this process that Jan has gone through just now and how we apply that in our designs. We're going to put the model right at the right-hand top corner so that you can see more or less where in the cycle this process is happening. I'm not going to mention it every time. It's going to be really boring then. So just watch what's on the screen and you will see where we are in this cycle of corp that we are talking about. Of course, many of these things are post-rationalized. We don't work according to that circle, meticulously in the office, not at all. If you know Jan's desk, you won't find anything. Mine is properly organized, so that's how it goes. The first project is our own house, Jewelskans, House Smith in Bloemfontein. And it was designed about 15 years ago, and it's very intuitive at that point in time, where the site played a tremendous important role, a dominant role. And it was not as deliberate as we are looking at things now at this point in time. Just starting with the divergent part of it, and you'll see that cycle. Just watch that top-hand corner, and you'll see where we are. Reacting on the concrete emotional experience of the site, we decided to buy the site immediately. The indigenous trees and the rocks and the views, etc., were the first attraction. And then reflecting on this, Jan actually decided that we needed to put this building, it wasn't my decision at that point, being the one that he says is always right. He decided to position the house in a very narrow linear position between the trees. We didn't want to remove any of the trees. And this implied that the main living spaces were to face north towards the indigenous bush, while the south, all the other service spaces moved to the south. To me, there was a very clear logic to where we needed to approach the house from, the east on the slope, along this linear wall, and then position the living boxes north and south of those of that wall and between the existing trees. Based on this concrete experience, and this is important, and the factual information that we had of the site, the trees which were plotted very carefully, we came up with some kind of a concept or a site strategy, which have the two boxes moving along the central line or the central wall. And the northern part would be glazed and the southern part would be more solid, and that was the concept that was in place. And with this conceptual approach in place, I could carry on and started to plot the site, the angle of the site, which is a 30-degree angle, which is quite a lot, in the eastern direction. And to the cul-de-sac, the bottom end is at the street. And the site was then mapped, measured, sections made, those ones that you saw right at the beginning, and so that we could determine where to place from a practical point of view, how to place the building on the site, and those different boxes supplied the solution to us. And just another influence on our design thinking at that stage was that we stayed in England for a while in a very small loft and thought that was quite comfortable. So we thought we don't need a huge house. We could live in small boxes. So the square meterage of the house needed to be very, very little, while spatially it needed to be quite nice in terms of volume, so small square meters, but quite big volumes. Other practical implications was the layout of the plan itself, which is a narrow building between the rocks and the existing trees. And that divided the organization very clearly into served and service spaces, the Carnian model, the two blocks north and south, and that also became the three-dimensional expression of the house. So 2D and 3D came very close. And to order the plan further, we had a structural system of 2.4 meters, just because that was sort of the standard size for an aluminium sliding door, which we used because of costs. Then Jan played with the elevations, and using, he wanted a floating roofscape, etc. The plan at that point in time was really quite predicting. The textures on the site were used in the choice of the materials, red brick, the deck in timber, and then we recycled some steel work from a dilapidated Corro brick factory. And then all those components created the general atmosphere, the feeling of the house, and the feeling that it belonged to its site. The only thing that Jan really could manipulate at that point in time was the southern side of the building, the southern facing wall, which became a mask. That's the right-hand side slide. For the onlookers and for ourselves, it framed the views from the inside. And it also emphasizes the two faces of the house, something that students always need to think about. North and south is very different, so your buildings need to reflect that. Spaces on the inside are open, and they flow across from the top to the bottom, and also from the front across. The house is only 168 square meters. It looks quite big, but it's not, and that is because of the volume. And then we extended the garden to in the same form as the plan of the house, where we lived in the bush area, and the garden then to the street side is more manicured. It's a little bit of a change in the concept of a Renaissance garden. Okay, the second house is House in Kilweni, also in Bloemfontein. This house is for a civil engineer and a medical doctor. Now you can think where they are on that diagram. Followed our house, and in a certain degree similar in terms of its concept, but the 2D, 3D started to be definitely better defined. There's a development in the structural system as well as the ordering of the plan. Again, it's identification and understanding of the natural landscape, which Jan usually does, and it gave us clues as to the approach. Again, a floating feeling, the building floating over the eastern slope. It's got the same eastern slope as our own house, but anchored in this rocky Free State copy. It was clear that the view towards the botanical gardens to the north needed to play quite a big role, and that all living room and spaces would view this way. Clues we got from the vernacular context of the nearby farms and played a major role in the development of the concept. An analysis of these buildings with steel sheds provided us with valuable information in helping our architectural language. The typology of the vernacular structures informed the use of the tectonic steel structure, the lighter structure, and then the more solid stereotomic brick or stone structures that we would use then for infill walls. And this together with the silo structures with their symbolic meaning of wealth, that's where we gather our food, captured the essence of the farmstead architecture on the surrounding farms. Then conceptually we thought that the view to the north over the botanical gardens needed to be framed, but the entrance was from the south side. So when entering the building from the south, one arrives in a void. It's a framed view. You enter the box to the right, the living box. There's not a real big front door. The front door is that void. Proceed up the staircase and a bridge across to the sleeping facilities or rooms at the other end across the opening. Structural models were built by myself and Henry Pretorius, who our colleague is in the audience as well this morning. And this rational approach was followed through in the organization of the plans as well. Again, we have the serviced and the service separation, the Carnian model, where you have your living spaces in the front and the north, and it's displayed three-dimensionally as well, and then the service space is at the back. So that became the three-dimensional expression. The house on the northern side are in essence are glass boxes, and on the southern side you have the services which were clad in corrugated iron, indicating its utilitarian qualities. The placement on the site itself is very important. Nkolweni seems to grow out of its site, as the construction drawings can be seen. But it's also anchored in the hill, with the roof floating above, framing the beautiful views. The anchoring elements, some of the interior. Right, a third example is called Boshuis in Bloemfontein, and the position of this house in an indigenous bush in Bloemfontein influenced and actually dominated the whole design and the design decisions. Due to Jan's intuitive reaction to place, this design happened very quickly, as soon as we got off the site after the first site visit. And Jan did some watercolors to try and understand the lay of the land, the textures and the colors, and this captured the general sense of place. Just very interesting, this is not a typical kind of site for Bloemfontein. We're used to quite harsh sites, so this is actually a very soft site to work on and not very typical of the type of place that we actually work in. The forest house plan was directly determined by the position of the majestic white stinkwood trees. The plan literally filled the spaces available between the trees. The architecture plays hide and seek between the trees and is supposed to disappear within the forest. The fact that the material that we chose for the southern facade or the entrance is copper will ensure that the building turns green in time, to ensure that this disappearing act can be done. So in concept, the house became a tree house, so that it disappears really, and where nature dictates and the materials help to conceal the house from view. It looks fantastic, but the house lies in a clay riverbed. So it needed to be on a raft foundation. So add to this the fact that we couldn't remove any trees, or that they couldn't be damaged, or that we didn't want to disturb the roots, provided a very interesting challenge to me and the client, who is a civil engineer. Both of us in the bottom left-hand corner, the convergers. So we had a ball, solving that foundation problem. It wasn't very easy, but we had a great time. The end result correlated with the initial concept of becoming one with the environment. The interplay of inside and outside turned out rather pleasing for both us and the client. The result of this house is a conclusion of almost all four quadrants at play, understanding each other's roles, accommodating that and supporting that. It was extremely pleasing to solve this, since the client, as I said, the one is a converger working on my side, and the other one is an occupational therapist, a diverger, playing with Jan. So it played well into our hands as designers. Fantastic, and we're very good friends after this. We travel the world with them. Okay, the last example from my side is House Ace in Bloemfontein. It's still a very important house in our oeuvre, and it's still a frame of reference to ourselves and many of our clients. The client's a graphic designer and a journalist, top right-hand corner, and us got along very well, and everything seemed to fall into place very quickly. It's a young couple with one boy, and they arrived from England, where they lived and worked. And they were, architecturally speaking, quite well informed, sometimes rare in Bloemfontein to find. And I still remember how they showed us one of Glenn Murcutt's houses, the Magni House. Sorry, just go back to that. and it became a major influence on our design. And to make the story even a little sweeter, Glenn visited the clients on their site during their construction phase. He was in Bloemfontein at one point. The site was less challenging than the previous projects because it's a flat piece of land, and the real challenge lied in finding a sense of place. There were no particular clues that we could gather from the site itself, except the views to the Free State Botanical Gardens to the north, so we had to look at in other directions. The Californian case study houses were used, and also the house of Glen Murcutt I just showed. And then Jan's first feeling was that this building should float. It should be a floating shed in this grass field, and this became apparent in his first drawings that he made. The idea was the steel structure is exposed, clearly showing the floated corrugated roof, and then a separation of the infill walls at the bottom. Again, we looked at the influence of the context, the nearby farms, the shed typology, and that played an important role. And since this house and House Enkalweni, the one with the, also against the slope, was designed together, built together, there are similarities. They share the same view. Things worked together in the office at that point. The steel modular architectural shed was used, and we clad the southern side again in corrugated iron. The steel silos from the surrounding area played a role in the studio of the building, and also in this screen wall for the external outside shower, which came from an older version of silos in the area, and those are beautiful. Again, the same rational approach was followed in the organization of the plan. That seems like our own house, where you could separate the spaces very clearly from service and served spaces, living spaces to the north and the service spaces to the south, very clearly reflected in the 3D as well. And then you have the shed-like modular system in steel with the non-load-bearing walls in between. And in this case, we used a butterfly roof. Jan's vision of this house, where it floated on the grass, became a reality. Glazed northern facade gives transparency to the house, while the southern corrugated iron cladding of the services are more of an agricultural feeling. House A seems to hover above the grass with a red brick wall that anchors it, as well as that brick tube, which is the entrance hall at the bottom with a small study at the top and a samba stair that takes you up there. And one wall is then extended into the landscape and provides privacy to the more private components of the house. To us, that is quite an exciting, typical contemporary Free State house.
That house would probably not make it with the new Sans 400, but nonetheless, it's built and the clients are still surviving. Monine, you're making me very nervous. There she stands with a gift. You can give us the gift and then we can carry on if you like. We're not really done yet. The next project, oh sorry, I slipped that one, is a project, it wasn't built, a weekend retreat in the Eastern Free State on a spectacular site. A nerve-wracking site, beautiful. So obviously the site and the feeling of the site became the most important thing. I started away with my watercolors and photographs again to get a feeling of what does it want to be, where are we going, looking at the other buildings, vernacular buildings in the environment. And the client was very familiar with the Coromandel house, closer to you, and they actually knew Sydney Press as well, the first owner. So that was the building that came along, and you'll see the influence, obviously, in the design. Petria did the analysis. We, once again, at the logical information, the layers of the landscape, all the caves and the rocks, the more disorder, and then the familiar koppies in the area with a solid rock on top, and then the in-between space with the silos once again. The first reaction architecturally was then to work with the layers, the top one, a linear layered look. The other one was the caves, rocks, echoing the site, or the copy, now changed into a glazed top part and not a solid one, on a solid rock and not the in-between space. And then the first, we introduced 5 options for the client. We tend to do this, and it's probably to do with my more divergent feeling, different possibilities, give them a choice. The more choices, the better the result. But it does confuse them, yes. In the end, this was the first one, a more layered look. A second one, modified layered, playing with the rocks and the caves on the site, folding on the site over the view. The third one, that was the copy, the solid one, with a glazed bedroom on top, with the stone walls at the bottom. A fourth one, more Mies van der Rohe-like, a radial plan. And then the final one, which probably a combination of them all, and they decided on this one, with the rhythm of the stone walls, the silo, once again, the more linear plan, but still radial as well. And the final presentation, I think I saw Jacques Verster, who was a student at the time and helped us with this presentation. Coincidence, afterwards I noticed this photograph of the environment of the silo and the rhythm of the sandstone, which came very close to the direct environment. The project, however, did not get off the ground. It was built, but not in this way. Nonetheless, it was an interesting exercise, working with that dramatic kind of landscape. Another one, just a project, was a film studio project that we did. This was a more out-of-the-box kind of project, in the sense that it's a competition-like thing. So we didn't know whether it was real. It was enormous. So too good to be true, and it turned out to be too good to be true in the end. So it was definitely not built, but a very nice exercise to go through the motions. Once again, a spectacular, vast site, a huge project. It's actually a town, a city on its own, with restaurants, practice rooms, 4 studios, living quarters, everything. So where to start? I started once again on the site, looking at the rock formations, the geology, trying to trace that and understand it. Started drawing that, get a feeling of the colors on the site, and abstracting that, decomposing, deconstructing, call it whatever you like, a way of understanding where we're going on the site with the rocks. And this developed into possible plans, so now a more deliberate way of working with the components, analysis, and how that turned into, for a competition kind of project, into a plan form towards final planning. 3-dimensionally, looking at what's underneath the surface, what is trapped within the geology, and that was directly on the site, and interesting ideas to start with 3-dimensional feelings of a building, a fragmented kind of building that will fit onto the site. Something floating on top and something anchored at the bottom. And the first watercolor superimposed on the site to get a feeling, colors of the Eysterklip, meaning the iron will oxidize and become red, and working with core 10, view towards north, viewing obviously to do with the film, and there you can see more conceptual ideas. In the end, that's the studios at the top and the more iconic individual buildings. Henry Pretorius once again helped with the housing component, where we joked where Angelina Jolie will stay and who will photograph her from what angle. Was a wonderful dream, but nonetheless. And then the model, and try and relate it back to where it started from. Geology, fragmented pieces from the painting into a complex. Then the final project, Moni, it's not that far anymore, we're close. In Napier, in the Western Cape, we've got a friend that bought a farm there, and he started a new wine farm. Dabar wines, if you see it shortly on the shelves, and Vierfontein Farm, one and the same thing. First, they needed to get the farm off the ground, so they planted blueberries just to keep the cash flowing. And for that, they needed a pump station for fertilizer. So it's a simple domestic building, but with that, they needed offices for the farm that will remain the office. And this needed to be the first architecture, and the wine cellar will then follow. And this is a current project. We're busy with it at the moment. We obviously, for an option one, we looked at the surrounding buildings, that typical buildings in the environment, pitch roof, the chimney, staircase on the gable, and we did the first design. We were not very happy with this, since it's more domestic and a bit overcomplicated for a simple utilitarian pump station. So we decided, back to the drawing board, or in my case, back to the paintbrush, understand the landscape, look at it, paint it, analyze it, dissect it, try and understand what's going on this site. A landscape painting, and see the process happening of a design into that beautiful landscape. And option two that worked well with the client, almost two rocks, an influence of Brian McKay lines in a landscape, played a huge role. And then the final third option that we went for, looking at the rocks and the lay of the land, understand the landscape itself and what it does, and the building itself and what it will look like on that slope, and how it will tumble down, so to speak. On the left is the pump station, and the right will become the offices with the braai and the entrance dividing the two from each other. And it's on site at the moment. We're doing supervision via cell phone and email, and it's proved to be very successful. When they send the photographs, I will tell them immediately, it feels like the steel is too thick. Make it thinner. It needs to look like the picture. Petra?
Thanks, Moulin. You can
Start walking.
Start walking. No, I'm not going to be long. Just as a conclusion, I think it's just important to put up that last diagram. If you've listened at the presentation, looked at what we said, I just want to come back to the title of the presentation, Demystifying the Design Process. There is a methodology appearing in the work that we are doing, and if we simplify that model, you can see it over there at the top right-hand side. It's the feeling, the diverger. It's the feeling of the site, the feeling of the place, observing what's going on there. Then we work through to the second phase, where we start to work with the facts on the site, and we start to develop a concept. To the converger side, right at the bottom left-hand side, adding to that concept now structure, function, etc., you start to create a building, and right at the top left-hand side, you start to manipulate those things into something much more concrete and something that you can that has becomes architecture. So for us, in a sense, it's not a total demystifying of the process, but it's starting for us to understand how design works and where we can start from. It's not going to dawn on you from heaven at night, at day, at some point. You need to work to get the inspiration. For me, inspiration and information is very closely related. It still remains a very individual process, but in our office this has worked very well for the past years. And we know the roles that we need to play and where our strengths and our weaknesses are. It has given our office quite a lot of energy, but it also gave us synergy, because we are two individuals and we need to work together. So when people still ask us, do you fight? We said no, because we know where the boundaries are. We know each other's design styles quite well, and it works very well. And we hope that this process is also going to create higher satisfaction for our clients and a more appropriate contemporary architecture from ourselves. Thank you.